For more than 30 years, the public thought they knew Rob Reiner. They knew the filmmaker who told warm, human stories about friendship, love, and moral courage. They knew the man behind films that taught audiences how to listen to one another. What they didn't see was the other life happening at the same time, quieter, angrier, and far more conflicted. Behind the camera, Rob Reiner was building empathy. Off-screen, he was fighting battles no script could contain. Friends say he lived with two identities that rarely touched: the storyteller who believed in dialogue and the private man who thrived on confrontation. One was celebrated, the other was hidden in plain sight. Only now, after everything has come to an end, are those two lives being forced into the same frame. And once you see how long this division lasted, it changes the way you understand everything he ever made. Growing up in the shadow of a giant. From the moment Rob Reiner was old enough to understand conversation, he understood conflict. His father, Carl Reiner, didn't just tell jokes, he used humor to expose uncomfortable truths. Dinner table arguments were normal, debate wasn't dangerous, silence was. Rob grew up watching adults challenge one another without breaking bonds, learning early that confrontation could coexist with affection. But living under a legendary name came with a cost. Rob wasn't expected to fail quietly, he was expected to be something, and rather than competing directly with his father's legacy, he learned a subtler strategy: observation. While others tried to dominate rooms, Rob listened. He watched how power shifted, how words landed, how tension could be managed rather than avoided. That habit followed him into adulthood, and it became the foundation of his first public identity, the persona America fell in love with. When Rob Reiner appeared on All in the Family as Michael "Meathead" Stivic, audiences saw a familiar archetype: loud, opinionated, morally certain. But behind the scenes, Rob was already doing something different. He wasn't interested in winning arguments. He was interested in exposing them. The show thrived on discomfort, race, war, gender, class, and Rob leaned into it. He believed that friction revealed character, and that laughter could disarm defenses long enough for truth to slip through. On camera, he argued fiercely. Off camera, he debated even harder. What people didn't realize was that Rob was learning something dangerous. Conflict worked. It drew attention, it forced engagement, and most importantly, it gave him a sense of control. That lesson would follow him far beyond television, leaving the spotlight to shape the story. At the height of his television success, Rob Reiner did something few understood. He walked away. Not because he was tired of acting, but because acting placed him inside someone else's frame. Directing, on the other hand, allowed him to orchestrate tension from a distance. It let him design moral puzzles without stepping into them personally. His films reflected that philosophy. Stand By Me wasn't nostalgic comfort, it was a quiet reckoning with loss and memory. The Princess Bride dressed moral clarity in fairy tale language, but never pretended goodness was simple. When Harry Met Sally examined intimacy as negotiation, not destiny. These stories made Rob Reiner beloved. They painted him as a humanist, a bridge builder, a man who trusted dialogue over dominance. But while audiences embraced that image, something else was hardening beneath it. The other life begins to take shape. Away from the set, Rob Reiner was changing. As his films accumulated praise, his private conversations grew sharper, less exploratory, more absolute. Friends noticed that debates no longer ended in mutual curiosity, they ended in winners and losers. The shift was gradual, almost invisible. It didn't look like anger, it looked like conviction. Rob had spent years constructing moral arguments for characters. Eventually, those arguments stopped staying on the page. He brought them into real life, where there were no edits, no rehearsals, no shared script to soften the landing. Publicly, he was still the filmmaker who believed in understanding. Privately, he was becoming a man who believed deeply in being right. That tension between the storyteller who invited questions and the individual who demanded answers lived side by side for decades. Most people only saw one half at a time. Hollywood applauded the films, friends navigated the conversations, and Rob himself seemed unaware that the distance between those two identities was growing. By the time the world began to notice the divide, it had already been there for years. And the next chapters of his life would make it impossible to ignore, because once the arguments left the screen and entered the public square, the two Rob Reiners could no longer pretend to be the same man. That's when the second life stopped hiding. Success, control, and the fear of losing the argument. As Rob Reiner's directing career peaked, so did his sense of authorship. Films gave him what life rarely does: control. He could shape conversations, decide when a character spoke, and determine which truth landed last. That power suited him. It rewarded conviction. And over time, it blurred a boundary that had once kept his art separate from his identity. Friends noticed a change. Discussions that used to feel exploratory began to feel instructional. Rob wasn't asking what others thought he was, explaining why they were wrong. The habit didn't come from malice. It came from confidence reinforced by decades of success. When your worldview keeps winning awards, it's easy to believe it's finished evolving. This was the quiet pivot. The storyteller who once trusted ambiguity began to mistrust it. Nuance started to feel like hesitation. And disagreement, once a creative engine, began to feel like resistance. When politics replaced the script, the shift became unmistakable when Rob Reiner stepped fully into public politics. Without characters to carry the argument, he carried it himself. Tweets replaced dialogue, interviews replaced scenes, and the tone hardened. He spoke with urgency, certainty, and moral clarity, traits that once belonged to his fictional heroes. Supporters applauded the directness. Critics recoiled from it. What made this phase so jarring was the contrast. The man who built a career on listening now spoke as if listening had become optional. The bridge builder had become a combatant, and unlike films, there was no third act to restore balance. Rob didn't seem to notice the irony, or perhaps he accepted it. To him, this wasn't contradiction, it was continuity. He had always believed conflict revealed truth. Now he was simply participating in it without the safety of a script. The second life was no longer hidden. 2 marriages, 2 tempos. At home, the contrast between Rob's public intensity and private needs became more pronounced. His marriage to Penny Marshall had been electric and volatile, 2 strong personalities colliding at full speed. Arguments were frequent. Creativity thrived. Peace did not. When it ended, it left scars that reinforced Rob's belief that friction was unavoidable. Years later, with Michelle Singer, life slowed down. The pace softened. Home became a refuge from the noise. Friends described Michelle as grounding, a counterweight to Rob's escalating public persona. It was here, away from cameras and arguments, that the 2 lives coexisted most starkly. Public Rob debated endlessly. Private Rob sought quiet. The tension wasn't dramatic. It was exhausting, and it required constant compartmentalization. The collision no one could edit. For 3 decades, Rob Reiner kept these lives separate enough to function. The artist asked questions. The activist delivered answers. Hollywood accepted the split because it benefited from the work. Audiences forgave the noise because the film still mattered. And Rob himself seemed convinced that the divide was manageable. Until it wasn't. When the final tragedy forced every chapter of his life into the same frame, the contradictions could no longer be edited apart. The man who believed in dialogue had spent years sharpening arguments. The humanist who trusted empathy had grown comfortable with confrontation. None of this explains the ending, but it reframes the life. Rob Reiner didn't become someone else late in life. He revealed parts of himself that had always been there, parts nurtured by success, reinforced by certainty, and insulated by admiration. The double life wasn't a secret affair or hidden scandal. It was a long-running internal division. And once the curtain fell, the question wasn't which Rob Reiner was real. It was whether the 2 could ever have been reconciled. That question lingers unfinished, unresolved, because some stories don't end with answers. They end by forcing us to look again at what we thought we understood all along. In the end, Rob Reiner's story is not about hypocrisy. It's about complexity. For more than 30 years, he lived with 2 forces inside him: the artist who trusted questions and the man who believed deeply in answers. One gave us films that invited understanding. The other stepped into the world convinced that silence was no longer an option. Neither version was fake. Both were real. And together, they formed a life that was far more complicated than the public ever allowed. The tragedy that closed his story does not explain him, but it does force us to look more honestly at how people evolve, harden, and sometimes lose the balance that once defined them. It reminds us that success can amplify conviction, and that certainty, when left unchecked, can quietly replace curiosity. If this story made you rethink who Rob Reiner really was, or how easily we reduce people to a single version of themselves, take a moment to reflect. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Like this video if you value stories that explore truth without easy judgment, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the lives behind Hollywood's most familiar faces. Because understanding someone fully often means accepting the parts that don't fit neatly together.